This is lecture 2 of a 6-week lecture class called The Great Heretic, The Life and the Radical Thought of Baruch Spinoza. And in the second lecture today, we are going to continue talking a little bit about Spinoza's life, but we're going to begin specifically looking at the Theological-Political Treatise. So those of you who hadn't seen it yet, here is a very famous portrait of Spinoza, a very fine portrait of him. There's done during his lifetime. We're not quite sure by who. There's another painting of him also done during his lifetime. He looks a little different there, but this is essentially looking pretty much like a 17th century Dutchman. I'm sorry because of the way things are. Not everyone's going to be able to see all this at once, but you'll get all this. The one thing is that people assume that when Spinoza was expelled from the community, he left Amsterdam. He didn't actually. He stayed in Amsterdam for a number of years. We don't know where he lived, pretty much, but he didn't leave until 1661. And he may have moved to a house of a friend 10 miles outside of Amsterdam, but he'd already learned to grind lenses, and this is how he supported himself. And in fact, he became well known as not only the grinder of very fine lenses, but also producer of microscopes and telescopes. It was one of the ways in which he became involved in a lot of the scientists of his time. And we know that he was actually in touch with some members of the Amsterdam Jewish community, which shows you that the ban of excommunication was not as impermeable as most people assume. But more or less, he himself, basically did not have much connection with the community after that. One of the fascinating things is that amongst the circle of people that he got to know were English Quakers, who became, by the way, the Pilgrims. You see, the people who became the Pilgrims actually had, because of their persecution in England, had moved to Amsterdam. And it was from Amsterdam that they eventually set sail for the New World. So he actually got involved. Some of them were in his circle of intellectual friends, his intellectual circles, and they actually asked him to translate certain tracts aimed at the conversion of the Jews into Hebrew, and he did. We don't know why, but he did. And these were very nice people, and they really, they thought, if Jews would be more amenable to Quakerism than other forms of Christianity. But so we know he did that. But he also became close friends with a man named Simon Juste de Vires, and my Dutch pronunciation is terrible. Another fellow named Adrian Carbaugh, another guy named Ludwig Meyer, and other people who were heavily involved in the spread of the philosophy and science of René Descartes. This was one of the very big controversies of the time. Descartes himself had lived in Amsterdam for quite a while, and so the sort of the role of Cartesianism was a big controversy because René Descartes' philosophy led to a very much more of a materialist view of reality, and so he was involved with this whole group of people who were Cartesians, and he became, a follower of René Descartes' ideas, but in fact went well beyond them. Yes, Steve?
Were the Quakers in Holland more like what we think of as the Pilgrims?
They were the Pilgrims. In other words,
They're not like the Quakers we think of today.
No, the Quakers have moved way on. In fact, there are Quakers today who really don't call themselves Christians anymore. They're way beyond that. So the people he met and became friends with, who became really close friends with, were radical Protestants, members who supported the Republican group, and they were all involved in the Cartesians. And we know that he began to write, but he did not begin to publish yet. And his writings would circulate amongst his friends. And very quickly he became the center of the group, because his genius emerged. By August 1661, he was settled at Ringenburg, a small village near Leiden, and he was already known for the quality of his lenses, microscopes, and telescopes by 1661. Now, why did he move there? possibly because he wanted to get away from the city. But it's not that he was a hermit or isolated. There was constant back and forth. The town itself was known for being a center of liberal people who thought similarly to him. But also because it was close to Leiden, it meant that he could go to the University at Leiden, which is what he did. He started auditing classes at the University of Leiden. Now, one of the interesting things is that he was visited by a man named Henry Oldenburg, who was born in 1619 and died in 1677, the same year as Spinoza. Here's Henry Oldenburg. His original name was Henrik. He was born in Emden, Germany, but he traveled around a lot and ended up in London, where he lived for most of his life. He was briefly imprisoned at one point in the Tower, but anyway, Henry Oldenburg was the part of the group of people who started the Royal Society in England. And the Royal Society was not the first scientific society. There was one in France. But I know it's a little warm in here. But Oldenburg was the first secretary of the Royal Society. And during one of his trips around the continent, through mutual friends, he met Spinoza, and they became fast friends for the rest of their lives. There were periods when it was a little difficult for them to correspond because of the wars between England and the Dutch, the Anglo-Dutch wars. But Oldenburg was primarily a scientist, and it was through Oldenburg that Spinoza met many of the most important scientists of the period. And that had a big impact on Spinoza's thinking, because science was moving in the direction, was rejecting the old models, the medieval models of the world, was accepting the Copernican view of things, accepting the science of Galileo, and really moving towards the idea of a materialist view of the universe, that there are no unseen powers, that everything works by natural laws, rejecting the notion of the miraculous. And so through Oldenburg, Spinoza met Robert Boyle, one of the greatest scientists of the period, famous for
Boyle's Law.
Yes, Boyle's Law, and he was the one responsible for really creating the science of chemistry. In other words, chemistry arose out of alchemy. And it was really Boyle who turned it from what was a kind of science/religious, spiritual movement, alchemy. We tend to have a kind of stereotype view of alchemy as being ridiculous, but it really wasn't. It was part of a whole spiritual system. But Boyle turned the study of the elements, basic things, into a science based on materialism, and completely cut it away from its spiritual elements. And that's one of the reasons why chemistry really began to evolve. And Boyle is one of the most critical things. Now, so we know that Boyle and Spinoza never met personally, but they corresponded, mostly on scientific matters, not on philosophical matters. Okay, so let's just go back a bit here.
Is that correspondence to extent?
Yes, we have you see, the thing about Spinoza is we don't have any of his personal writings, but we actually have a fair bit of his correspondence with scientists and philosophers. Again, there are gaps and whatever. So in 1661 to 1662, he wrote a book called The Treatise on the Emendation of the Intellect, which was an essay on philosophical method, which he did not publish. He, again, circulated. And he wrote something called The Short Treatise on God, Man, and His Well-Being. They were only published after his death. All right. Now, in early 1663, he was already writing his work, The Ethics, which became his most important work after, really. But he was circulating drafts. But again, it was not published until after he died, for a variety of reasons. By then, he'd moved to Voorburg, just outside The Hague, where he meets Christian Huygens, I think I'm pronouncing that right, who lived between 1629 and 1695. There he is, in a beautiful portrait of him from his youth. Huygens was the leading Dutch scientist of the age, and one of the greatest continental scientists of the 17th century. And they met personally, and they had quite a long correspondence. Huygens is mostly known for his math as a mathematician, by the way. What's interesting is that despite the fact they knew each other for a long time, when Huygens tended to write other people, he referred to Spinoza as the Jew at Würzburg, which shows you kind of the limits of tolerance, right? In 1663, Spinoza published his first printed work under his name called Descartes' Principles of Philosophy, which was a commentary on the basic principles of Descartes. And it was not only just a commentary explaining Descartes, but it also where he disagreed with Descartes and where he went beyond Descartes. It started off, by the way, as a primer for a student who had kind of bugged him into being a private tutor, somebody who wanted to study with him, study Descartes with him, because Spinoza was quite well known as an expert on Descartes. So this was published under his own name and was widely circulated. In 1663, there was periodically there were these massive plagues that broke out in Europe. There was another one that broke out. And in 1664 to 1667 is the Second Anglo-Dutch War. You have to understand there were a series of 3 wars at this time where the Dutch went to war with England. Sometimes they declared war, sometimes the English declared war. And in the end, the Dutch, by the end of the third one, the Dutch came out really badly. But the point is that this affected trade, this affected all kinds of things, and it affected the political situation in the Netherlands because it was during these wars that the supporters of the stadtholder became prominent because they wanted somebody to lead the nation into war. And also when one of the wars went badly, the Republicans were blamed. And as we will eventually see, the leader of the Republican groups ended up being killed by a mob, probably whipped up by the monarchists. Anyway, during this time, he goes to Amsterdam for a short visit to his friends and his publisher, and he's nearing a completion of the draft of the Ethics, but he puts it aside. Instead, he begins to write the Theological-Political Treatise. Why? It starts because there's a religious dispute within the town of Würzburg between the liberals and the strict Calvinists, in which he gets caught up in. In other words, he is used as a foil by the strict Calvinists to attack the liberals because they say they're allied with this atheist Jew, right? So that's one of the things that begins to move him towards writing this book. Second thing is this fight going on generally in the Netherlands. Thirdly, this is when the outbreak of the heresy of Shabtai reaches Amsterdam. Now, for those of you who don't know, Shabtai was a person who claimed to be the Messiah. He was born in Smyrna in Turkey, and depending upon who you read, he's either a Sephardic, an Ashkenazic, or a Romeite. A Romeite were the indigenous Greek Jews, meaning the Jews who'd lived in Greece since ancient times and had their own, you might call Greek Yiddish, Judeo-Greek. Most of the surviving community, most of the community was killed off in the Holocaust. There are very few left, and I think nobody speaks the language anymore. But his father came from Greece and probably was from this background. What happens is that this Shabtai Tzvi probably was what we would call bipolar or a manic depressive. He studied Kabbalah, and starting already in 1648, he began to start making claims to be the Messiah. He was kicked out of various places by the rabbinate, and he wandered around a lot. But eventually he ended up in Israel and met his St. Paul, so to speak, a guy named Nathan of Gaza. And through Nathan's incredible genius in propaganda, managed to really promote the idea that he was the Messiah. And one of the impetuses for all of this was there were huge massacres in Eastern Europe which was part and parcel sort of the 30 Years' War, just after the 30 Years' War of Jews in Eastern Europe under the Chelmnicki massacres. Again, the number of Jews killed we don't know, but thousands of Jews were displaced. So there was a great deal of messianic fervor going on in the 1660s, not just amongst Jews, but Christians as well. And so Shabtai Tzvi, by the 1665, was being proclaimed as a Messiah throughout the Jewish communities from Yemen to London, essentially. And a lot of people thought he was the Messiah. Anybody who was an opponent of him was silenced. And people were selling their property, packing up their belongings. They thought that they were going to be magically transported back to the land of Israel. We know this from the writings of Gluckel of Hamelin, a very famous Yiddish, one of the earliest pieces of Yiddish literature written by a Jewish woman at the end of her life in the 17th century, and when she talked about how she was a young girl, this thing had broken out and her father started packing stuff in barrels to move. We know this from English, the English ambassador to the Ottoman court reports about this. In other words, and Christians were quite fascinated by this because amongst Christians, the year 1666, for some Christians, was the time when they thought the second coming of Jesus was going to happen because of the number 666, which is one of the numbers that comes out in the book of Revelation. And what happens is this movement comes to Amsterdam. And the chief rabbi of Amsterdam, who by this point is Isaac Aboab, who became the chief rabbi after the death of Mortera in 1660, Aboab enthusiastically joins this movement. So here it is. Spinoza probably saw firsthand this happening in Amsterdam. In fact, Oldenburg writes him a letter at some point asking him, "What do you think about all of this?" We don't know if he ever replied because we don't have a reply from Spinoza. So you can understand how also seeing around him what he considers to be superstition and foolishness amongst his own people would also add to the impetus for writing this book, as you will see. The other thing also is that his tutor and friend Van de Endon, who he was the one who he learned Latin with and was first exposed to many of the political writings of the period, published a book called The Free Political Institutions. Van Endon published it anonymously in Amsterdam, and it was a strong statement of republicanism and criticizing traditional religion. There was also at the time a book published which questioned the divine origin of Scripture that Spinoza undoubtedly read.
Who wrote that?
I forget who wrote that. But the point is, these currents were floating around at the time. He wasn't the only one thinking in this direction. In 1666, Shabtai Tzvi is the Ottoman Sultan decides enough of this, and he arrests Shabtai Tzvi and he forces him to convert to Islam, which the movement then more or less collapses. However, it continues underground. There's a number of his followers who, first of all, convert with him, but continue to practice their heretical form of Judaism secretly. And they lasted, by the way, there's still some of them around today. They're called the Dunma in Turkey. But there were also Sabbateans who said this is all part of the divine plan, that he should be forced to convert to Islam. And at first, Shabtai Tzvi himself was granted sort of pension and a certain status by the Sultan, and allowed to live publicly and so on. But when it was found out that in fact he was not really being an Orthodox Muslim, but was continuing to practice this kind of heretical Judaism, he was thrown into prison. And we think that's where he died. We're not 100% sure exactly when he died. What happens in the Jewish communities is that you begin to have a conflict between the establishment who takes over again in the wake of this disaster and these secret Sabbateans. And there is a kind of, over the course of almost 100 years, there is accusations that go back and forth that so-and-so is actually a secret Sabbatean and so on and so forth. And in fact, we know there were Sabbateans who remained undercover all the way through the 19th century, by the way. Prague apparently was a center of secret Sabbateanism, and one of the ancestors of Louis Brandeis was a secret Sabbatean in the United States. We have the will of this man from the 19th century, where he basically urges his children to continue in this true faith. So it's interesting how long the Sabbatean movement lasts.
None today.
Not that we know of. But in the 18th century, there was a huge controversy when a prominent German rabbi, Yakov Emden, accused another prominent rabbi, Eibeschutz, of being a secret Sabbatean on the basis of certain amulets that Eibeschutz had produced, because Eibeschutz was a Kabbalist, accusations went back and forth and back and forth. And in fact, Gershom Scholem in the 20th century, who was the great scholar of Sabbateanism and Kabbalah, ended up saying, Emden was right. Eibeschutz really was a secret Sabbatean. So it had a lot of legs. That's what I'm trying to say to you. And it roiled the community. It really began, some people think that in a certain way, this is the beginning of the break. This is a major factor in the breakdown of the traditional Jewish community structures from the Middle Ages, the Sabbateanism.
What was it all about? I mean, I understand this guy presented himself as the Messiah, but what was the
Well, because as the Messiah, he pulled on certain Kabbalistic ideas that with the coming of the Messiah, certain aspects of Jewish law were no longer needed. So he was eating on Tisha B'Av and doing other things. It was a whole number of things that they were doing. It's a very complex, and Gershom Scholem wrote a very thick and fat book about it, which I did read once.
It was kind of a radical view of Judaism.
Yes, it was. And
morphed into reform.
Well, no, it didn't morph into reform, but what was interesting is there was another such false messianic movement in Europe in the 18th century under a guy named Yakov Frank, who was definitely a kind of sort of spiritual descendant of Shabtai Tzvi, and these are some of the things that begin to break down the traditional authorities in Europe. And by the way, when the Hasidic movement arrived in the middle of the 18th century, it was one of the reasons why the religious establishments in many places were so skeptical and anti-Hasidic, because they thought, here we go again, right? Okay. Anyway, at the same year, his friend Ludwig Meyer publishes, by his publisher, a book called the Philosophia, again, part of this whole radical movement. But one of the things that really probably pushed Spinoza finally to really want to publish this book was the trial of his friend Adrian Carbaugh. Carbaugh had written some really radical anti-Trinitarian works, denying the divinity of Jesus and the divinity, the divine status of the Bible. And Carbaugh was not a careful man, and his brother, who was a minister, they were both arrested. His brother had nothing to do with it, so he was let go. Carbaugh was imprisoned. He was tried because the Calvinists were in the ascendancy at Amsterdam at this time, and he was convicted of blasphemy and sentenced to 10 years in prison, and they also rounded up every copy they could find of his work and burned it. He could have gotten a severe penalty than imprisonment, apparently, a mutilation. But Carbaugh dies within a year in prison because of the terrible conditions there. And this was a shocking event to the liberal circles and to Spinoza, that the government would become an arm of the strict Calvinists, right? That the government would try to impose a religious orthodoxy, because Amsterdam was known for you can say what you want as long as you keep the peace, pretty much. But again, this was a very tenuous kind of a thing. And Carbaugh acted in some ways really dangerously by publishing this stuff in his own name. We have some of the records of the trial. He was specifically asked about whether he had discussed any of this with Spinoza, because they may have wanted to go after Spinoza, since he was known as a famous atheist. And one of the things he did, and I don't know whether he was lying or not, he denied discussing the work with Spinoza maybe he did it to keep Spinoza out of trouble. But the fact is, this was a shocking thing for the circles that Spinoza lived in. And as a result, within a year, he published the Theological-Political Treatise by his publisher in Amsterdam, but with a false publisher name and no author's name. And he moves to The Hague at that point. By the way, here is a contemporary drawing of Shabtai Tzvi from one of the Sabbatean books that got published. You have to understand, because of the printing press, there were all kinds of Sabbatean pamphlets that were being published, and propaganda and books and so on. Yes?
Rabbi, please tell us more about the word Sabbatean.
Well, it comes from Shabtai.
Okay.
In other words, he is called Shabtai because it's very common among, and he lived mostly in, even though he was not Sephardic, he lived in the Sephardic culture of the Sephardic exiles, and the impact of that on Kabbalah was huge, so that was sort of wrapped up in it. So Sephardim are more likely than Ashkenazim, if a child is born on the Sabbath, to name them Shabtai. But still you will find, even amongst Ashkenazim, sometimes if a child was born on Pesach, that would become the boy's name. Or my late uncle Sam, his name was Simcha, because he was born on Simchat Torah. So Shabtai Tzvi was born on a Sabbath, and that's where we get Sabbatean. Anyway, this is the copy of his commentary, the title page of his commentary to Spinoza. And here is his seal ring. Now, if you look, it has his initials, but at the bottom there is a Latin word, C-A-U-T-E, caute. Anybody know what that means in Latin?
C-A-U?
C-A-U-T-E.
Has something to do with the tail?
No.
It's C-A-U.
Caution. His motto was caution. Yep, right.
Oh, yes.
Okay, caution. And we know he used it because we have a letter of his to Leibniz, who he met later on, where it's stamped at the bottom of the letter.
In Ostia Antica, they have signed, Cave Canem.
Yeah, well, that's it. So that was his byword. And I'm showing it to you because this is why he had to be extremely careful about publishing anything publicly. And by the way, why Oldenburg was constantly pushing him to publish his works, including the Ethics, and he consistently refused. And in fact, there was somebody who was in the process of writing a Dutch translation of one of the drafts of the Ethics, because Spinoza wrote in Latin, and he told him, "Stop it, don't do it anymore." And the guy did, and destroyed the translation, because he was extremely careful about all of this, because he saw one of his best friends die in prison, and other friends of his being persecuted, and the conflicts that were going on in the Netherlands over the fight between the radicals / Republicans, the conservatives / monarchists.
This is even after he was expelled.
Yes, I'm not. This is not in the Jewish community. This is in the Christian community.
Did he have more latitude because he was not a true member of the Christian community?
No, it wouldn't have. It wouldn't have helped. It wouldn't have helped him in the least bit.
He would be less a blasphemer because
well,
he wasn't Christian.
First of all, don't forget he moved around, so he was not always under the same political authority even within the Netherlands. You see, that's the point. If he had been in Amsterdam and they wanted to arrest him, it would have been the Amsterdam authorities. If he, but he wasn't living in Amsterdam, or he was he was outside of The Hague, or whatever. The point is that it would be the local authorities. And again, in the Netherlands, each of these states, some of them were more towards the liberals and some more towards the conservatives. But he could see what was going on. He had a really good political nose, you might say, and was extremely careful about all these things. So here is the title page of the Theological-Political Tractate. And in fact, in the book, that if you take a look in the book and you open up to page Roman numeral, it's actually page 2, they give it to you in English here, right? It's right after the introduction. All right? Do you guys need a copy of this?
It's all ordered.
Okay, here. This is what we're going to look. I know some people weren't going to necessarily.
So the conclusion
Do you need a
would be
copy?
that he was not a
Today,
zealot
yes.
for his beliefs. Yeah.
He was. Look, the point is when he got published, a lot of people knew he wrote this. Okay, but he could And what's interesting is whoever owned this copy, and I don't know who owned the copy, wrote his name here. If you read the writing, it says Benedictus de Spinoza. Okay, whoever owned this copy knew it was written by Spinoza or somebody at some point. But if you take a look, here's the English translation, and it's important to take a look at it. He calls it the Theological-Political Treatise. Now this is important because he starts with theology. You need another one?
Yeah.
He starts with theology and ends with, and the second part of it deals with politics that arises out of the theology. But it's not really a philosophical book in many ways. It's more of a book, although his philosophy underlies it. It is a very practical book in many ways, as you will see. I'll start describing it a little better in a minute. But look, containing several discourses which demonstrate that freedom to philosophize may not only be allowed without danger to piety and the stability of the Republic, but cannot be refused without destroying the peace of the Republic and piety itself. He is asking for complete freedom of thought. All right? This is one of his key goals in writing this, was there should be complete freedom of thought to express what you believed. Yes, Steve?
Why is his first reference to John?
He published this anonymously, and he knew he was writing this for a Christian world. Okay? He was not writing this for the Jewish community. He was writing this for the Dutch Republic, the Dutch, And notice, it claims to have been published in Hamburg, and it's claimed to have been published by this guy, Heinrich Kunracht. Well, no but such person ever existed. Okay? We know it was published in Amsterdam, and we know that it was published by his Spinoza, Jan Ruegwerts, or however his name is pronounced. Okay? We just know it.
I thought last week's lecture said there was a person with this name.
No, there wasn't.
A writer, that the publisher used the name.
Oh, yes, that's right. I did mention that. The publisher did use the name of somebody, but...
Previous writer.
Yeah, exactly. He was probably intended as an arcane joke, you see. This being the name of a well-known early 17th century German mystical writer. Okay, you're right. The point is, he was extremely cautious about this. So, what is he trying to do here? His goal, as he states right off the bat, was to strengthen freedom and liberty of thought for the individual and for Dutch society by weakening religious authority and divorcing theology and scripture from philosophy. That's what he's trying to do.
Divorcing them from philosophy?
Yes, in other words...
Are you quoting?
No, I'm writing from my own notes here. The point is that, if we had a projector, you could all see it.
Could you
But
say that sentence again, by divorcing?
divorcing theology and scripture from philosophy. Now, in doing this, he was going against the entire tradition of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that dates back to Philo of Alexandria in the 1st century. The Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria was the first one that we know of to interpret Scripture allegorically as a work of philosophy. And it was that Philo had not during his lifetime, had a big influence on the church fathers, who incorporated Philo's method into their own analysis of Scripture, which then went into Islam, which then went into Judaism, and then back to Christianity. Okay? And of course, who's the great expositor of this method in Judaism? Maimonides. And one of the things that, there's been a lot of argument over the influence of Maimonides on Spinoza. I mean, part of it is Spinoza was attacking all medieval philosophy, and just not, but he doesn't actually mention Maimonides much, but it's pretty evident that the whole tradition that Maimonides represents, and he's read Maimonides, we know he read the Guide for the Perplexed, he's completely ripping that to shreds. He's rejecting that whole idea. So again, it may not be a specific attack on Maimonides, but it was certainly what he is going against, that whole approach, which again was not just in Jewish thought. So the traditional there were four traditional modes of interpretation of Scripture, and in Hebrew they called this pardes, P-A-R-D-S. It's a Persian word that entered Hebrew during the Persian Empire, and it means orchard or garden. But it's where we get our English word paradise from, but it became in Talmudic times to refer to heaven, Gan Eden, right? But also the place of where the mystics tried to arrive, right? But in the Middle Ages, it was used as an acronym for four different modes of interpretation. And the Jews got this, by the way, from Christians. Christians didn't use the word pardes, but the fourfold interpretation of Scripture was taken from the Christians. So pardes stood for pshat, P-E-S-H-A-T, which is the plain meaning of the text. Now, the plain meaning of the text in the Middle Ages is not what we mean to this day. Rashi tried to show the plain meaning of the text, but it was the plain meaning of the text as understood by rabbinical Judaism. Okay? Sometimes his grandson, who was also a great biblical commentator, criticized his grandfather that you didn't really get to the pshat. Anyway, because Rashi sometimes will tell you what something means, and then he will give you what the D part is. The D in pardes is drash, the homiletical interpretation, right? Using it as a moral or something like. This is where you see a lot of the more creative midrashim are drash. The R stands for remez, which means hint, and is the allegorical hint.
H-I-N-T?
Yeah. Remez is the allegorical or philosophical meaning. Meaning, yes, the journey of Abraham from Ur to Canaan really happened, but it also represents the journey of the soul towards enlightenment. That's one of Philo's things, right? So the philosophers, and Maimonides was a big part of this, tried to understand the text as it were a way of learning philosophy. And Maimonides felt that one could learn philosophy without revelation, but most people weren't smart enough to do that. And therefore revelation comes to help teach people all of these important truths that they would not normally be able to do on their own. Right? Okay. The S in pardes stands for sod, S-O-D, which means secret. And this was the mystical meaning of the text. In other words, Middle Ages, the Kabbalistic interpretation of the text, which was different than the philosophical one, although it fed off that. But this is where, when you read the Zohar, for example, the Zohar reads the Torah specifically and the rest of the Hebrew Bible as a code. for deep meaning about the inner workings of God. And they connect up each word, and in some cases letters, to their whole Kabbalistic system. So Spinoza was rejecting this entire mode of interpretation. Yes?
2 questions.
Sure.
Was Rambam a break from the Talmudists?
No.
He was just the highest.
Well, he was very much a halachist, but he was also a philosopher, and philosophy was really a kind of ideology of the intellectual elite in his time, not the average person.
That the Gaonim didn't.
Well, some of the Gaonim were philosophically in mind, but he had conflicts with the Gaon in Babylon, but the guy was a midget compared to him.
And the other question is, did Spinoza consider himself primarily a Jew or an international person?
That's a good question. He was always called a Jew by other people. The question, what did he actually think of himself, is an open issue. We'll talk about that a little bit in the last class. But I'm not sure he ever said, but he definitely did not consider himself in any way observant, and I would say he probably completely divorced himself he tried to completely divorce himself from his Jewish identity. So what was his method? His method, first of all, was to use rules of interpretation, hermeneutics, to use commentary, exegesis, and historical criticism. Maimonides is the father of modern historical analysis of the Bible. Now, he wasn't the first, but in some ways his work was the most influential in challenging the divine status of Scripture and trying to set Scripture outside of these modes of interpretation and putting it within its historical framework. Now, he obviously didn't have archaeology and ancient languages that were later discovered and so on, but through the text alone, he tried to understand the historical setting of the Bible, not in the way it was previously understood. So he was trying to analyze the Hebrew Bible in a way that was very different than what Jews and Christians had been doing up until that point. Whether they were strict halachists, whether they were mystics, whether they were philosophers, whatever, in the Jewish community or in the Christian world. He insisted on approaching the text with no previous judgments about its meaning and significance. At least that's what he tried. Yes, Robert?
When he went through this, it was purely the Torah, and he didn't go through the New Testament?
No. Well, you'll see. It was the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures. He focused on that. He didn't really do this he didn't really do it with the New Testament, but he does quote the New Testament. He knows the New Testament by this point. Also, one of the things that he did, again, this is why I had to mention his friendships with the scientists, is he used natural science, the principles of the natural science of his day, against any claims of the supernatural. In other words, he rejected anything in the Hebrew Bible that was miraculous or supernatural. Now,
that makes it a pretty thin book, doesn't it?
Well, it's interesting, he refers indirectly to Maimonides by saying, people interpret certain miracles as being dreams and so on and so forth. But he's saying, no, that's not what it says. Let's look at it exactly what it says. And he often uses the word superstition, right? Which for him means supernatural beliefs in the supernatural. And he was a naturalist in all of that.
Are we talking of a man who is compared to Scalia with his original interpretation?
No, I would not venture that way. Yes.
In those days, they called science natural philosophy.
Yes, they did.
So because that's what he was doing. He was getting philosophy and science, seeing them together.
That is a very good point. Science was not considered apart from philosophy. That only occurred in the 19th century. And the word scientist did not exist. The word scientist was invented by British scientists in 1844. In other words, Up until that point, what we call scientists were called natural philosophers, and often not only involved philosophy in what they were doing, but were often interpreted what they were doing in their own personal theological context. People like Newton. I mean, Newton was an alchemist. I mean, there all these things. But in the mid-19th century, the British Academy for the Advancement of Science decided to create a term for those who do science to divorce it from philosophy and theology. And so they came up with the word scientist as an analogy between art, artist, science, scientist. It was invented at their convention in 1844. Okay? So again, many of the materialist scientists he corresponded with, like Huygens and Boyle, were Christians. And many of the people that, when this book was published, who were Christian liberals, were appalled by how far he went with it, as we will see. But the point is, and even Leibniz, who became a follower of his, publicly denounced it, which was probably a really hypocritical act on Leibniz's part. But we'll get to that eventually.
But he didn't go that far, because if he says that these events in the Bible that appear to be miraculous are not, then he is taking it as almost divinely written that something like this happened. In other words, he's not saying,
divinely written.
Well, but he's not saying some author wrote it as the supernatural. So when writes supernatural, that doesn't make anything supernatural.
He is going to say the fact that some of the authors, they just, this stuff never happened and they wrote these miracles for whatever reasons, okay?
Fine.
But he accepts that, yes, the Bible, to a certain extent, he accepts there are historical events in the Bible that actually took place. Moses was a real person, he focuses on Moses a lot, you will see. But you'll see, he rejects all kinds of classical Jewish doctrine, Christian ideas. Anyway, so he uses natural science, but his form of what is called empiricism is much stronger and more radical than Boyle, Newton, or Locke. All right? So he is a strict empiricist, and it's that's going to have a big influence later on. And one has to understand him as part of the early 17th century Dutch Enlightenment. In other words, when the Enlightenment is usually studied, it's usually studied primarily within the context of French and English philosophers. But there was a very significant Dutch Enlightenment philosophy. People like Van de Endon, Mayer, Carbaugh, which often in Anglo-American circles tend to get neglected. All right? And so we have to see him as part of this very significant 17th century Dutch Enlightenment, which, by the way, people make a comparison between the Jeffersonian notion of the Enlightenment, which is very English and very French, and is based on the notion of sort of gentleman farmers and agrarian society, their vision of society. The Dutch Enlightenment is about urban and merchant class people. And in many ways, people who uphold this myth of the Jeffersonian Enlightenment or Jeffersonian ideas of democracy, they're kind of irrelevant. Our society is urban and merchant more, you might say. So in many ways, the real impact on modern democracy really as much comes out of these Dutch Enlightenment ideas rather than these agrarian notions. And there, Spinoza is a very important part of it. Okay, so now let's go to his preface. And I think that I wanted to, this is a large book. We're obviously not going to read all of it. But I really felt that the preface is a really important place to start because he really lays out his entire program here. And our notes tell us what chapters refers to, very handily. And so what we'll be able to do is to see the whole work, the whole aim of the book, And then starting next week, we'll go into very specific parts of it. And we're going to do a little bit of his biblical criticism, but I would actually think you'd be more interested in looking at the political part, because that really is. I'll try and balance it out. But anyway, let's and Irma's got a copy which has notes in it from somebody. Did they actually write notes in the preface? Sorry, it was Suzanne.
I bought a new one.
Oh, okay, Suzanne, is there anything interesting written in the preface?
Well, there's lots of stuff.
All right, well, if there's anything that's really interesting, he'll tell us whoever your anonymous commentator was wrote it. But Irma, do you want to begin reading on page 3? It is if men.
If men were always able to regulate their affairs with sure judgment, or if fortune always smiled upon them, they would not get caught up in any superstition. But since people are often reduced to such desperate straits that they cannot arrive at any solid judgment, and as the good things of fortune for which they have a boundless desire are quite uncertain, they fluctuate wretchedly between hope and fear. This is why most people are quite ready to believe anything. When the mind is in a state of doubt, the slightest impulse can easily steer it in any direction, and all the more readily when it is hovering between hope and fear, though it may be confident, pompous, and proud enough at other times.
He starts with a psychological observation. And by the way, Freud read Spinoza. Okay, Spinoza was one of the things that Freud liked a lot. And notice he begins with a psychological observation, that people are more likely to believe in superstitious ideas, as you will see, when they are fearful and doubtful. And, when people are, kind of nice and settled and feeling, secure, they don't tend, he says, to indulge in that. Yeah.
I'm sure he thought of it as being a universal state, but it would seem to me it applied particularly to the status of the Jews, who were always in a status of uncertainty about their future.
That is possible, but I think he saw around him with the plagues and the wars and everything, the ups and downs of the economy, because these wars had tremendous impact on the Dutch economy.
The tulip scare.
Well, yes, the great tulip bubble and all this kind of stuff. So he in his own lifetime saw what people did in times of uncertainty, that fear is one of the great motivators, he says, of superstition, as he understands the word. Read on.
I think that everyone is aware of this, even though I also believe that most people have no self-knowledge.
Meaning most people don't really reflect on themselves very much. Go on.
For no one can have lived long among men without noticing that when things are going well, most people, however ignorant they may be, are full of their own cleverness and are insulted to be offered advice. But when things go wrong, they do not know where to turn, and they will seek guidance from anyone. No suggestion they hear is too unwise, ridiculous, or absurd to follow. Moreover, for the flimsiest of reasons, they are conditioned one moment to expect everything to go better, and the next to fear the worst. For when they are afraid, anything they see that reminds them of some good or bad thing in the past seems to prognosticate a happy or unhappy outcome. And so they call it a good or a bad omen, even though they have been disappointed 100 times in the past.
Right? In other words, you ignore the omens when they're wrong. If they're right, you say, oh, look at that, a great sign. This is marvelous. I mean, this is so modern. And I mean, this is why he is seen as one of the first modern men.
Again, if they see anything out of the ordinary that causes them great astonishment, they believe it to be a prodigy, which indicates the anger of the gods or of the supreme deity, and they think it would be sinful not to expiate it by offering sacrifice and prayers, because they are addicted to superstition and averse to true religion.
Again, he's not an atheist, but his view of what constitutes religion is extremely radical.
So who added the true in parentheses?
The translator.
So what is his
So
true
what does
religion?
it mean by?
You'll get that. You'll get there.
They develop an infinite number of such practices and invent extraordinary interpretations of nature, as if the whole of nature was as senseless as they are.
Now, what's interesting is notice he's attacking ritual. right, and prayer. On the one hand, that's a very Protestant thing to do. On the other hand, Yovel thinks this is also a very Marrano thing to do, because when the conversos arrived in Amsterdam, they had been generations without contact of living Judaism and didn't know about the whole, structure of rabbinic Judaism with its rituals and understandings and interpretations. And it wasn't an easy transition, and some of them were appalled by it. And as those of you who were in the first class, he wasn't the first one to get excommunicated for radical ideas. Uriel da Costa, during his childhood, was someone who couldn't handle the transition, right? So in that respect, his view of ritual and ceremonies is both very Protestant on some level, and this is where you have to understand Protestantism had a big influence, and also very Marrano, to use Yuval's term. In other words, the Protestant movement, and there was a book that clocks this very carefully in England, because of its stance against ritual and what they called in England popery, was an attack upon the magical worldview, right? Which saw rituals as being efficacious in making actual changes in the world, right? Shrines, saints, relics. So, in England, when the Reformation really took hold, during the time of Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, okay, there was that was when the reformers, knocked down it started on Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, but there's this guy named Keith Thomas who wrote a very fat book called Religion and the Decline of Magic, how the Protestant worldview reduced this idea of the magical worldview and was one of the things that helped clear the way for modern science. So Spinoza's part of that whole idea. You have to understand him within that cultural context. All right. Suzanne, you want to pick it up from number 3?
This being the case, we see at once that it is especially those who have a boundless desire for things that are uncertain, who are the most prone to superstition of every kind, and especially that all humans, when they find themselves in danger and are unable to support themselves, implore divine assistance with pleas and womanish tears.
As it says, there are no atheists in a foxhole.
They swear that reason is blind and human wisdom fruitless because it cannot show them a sure way of acquiring the empty things they want. On the other hand, they believe that the delirious wanderings of the imagination, dreams, and all sorts of childish nonsense are divine replies, that God is averse to the wise, and that rather than inscribe his laws in the mind, he writes them in the intestines of animals, and that fools, madmen, and birds reveal them by divine inspiration and impulse. It is dread that makes men so irrational.
He's talking to these Torah, right? The scroll.
He's talking about all religion. He's talking about all religion.
The Romans certainly read the intestines.
Yes, exactly. He's referring to the classical ideas of reading the entrails of animals and so on and so on and so forth. But he's also indirectly referring to any kind of ritual in his own day. And don't forget, traditional Judaism at this point was filled with not just what we would call the rituals of Shabbat and Kashrut, but all kinds of things that we would consider today completely superstitious practices, a magical worldviews, belief in amulets, belief in demons, and even in a sophisticated community like Amsterdam, people did all kinds of stuff like this, right? It's something, of course, that Maimonides railed against, but, he was not successful. Yeah.
When I read he writes them in the intestines of animals, I think he's referring to the use of animal, intestinal skin to write the Torah.
No, he's not. No, he's referring specifically to the Roman pagan practices of slaughtering an animal and looking at its intestines with the idea that you will see there some signs that you can read that will tell you the future. Yeah, Stephen.
The reference to intestines reminds me of people who don't like to think, but rather decide what their gut tells them.
Good point.
Gut reaction.
All right, so again, he's explicating on this notion of fear, and you see he's a really good writer in this and how his transition. Now go on, number 4.
Hence, fear is the root from which superstition is born.
So 1 second, Suzanne. You notice he attacks dreams, right? The idea of dream omens, but also the idea that people think that God spoke to them, right? And he says, God is averse to the horizon rather than inscribe his laws in the mind. This is going to become a very important point philosophically, right? That the true way in which you, connect with God is through the mind. Go on.
If anyone wants to go further into this matter and consider particular examples, let him contemplate Alexander the Great.
We don't have to read this. This is an incident in the biography of Alexander the Great that when he was, that the author claims, an ancient author, he's quoting that when Alexander was doing well, he never asked about prophets, but when he got, he was having problems, he started doing that. So we can skip that. But essentially, so skip down to many similar examples.
Many similar examples could be given, which show with complete clarity that people are swayed by credulity only so long as they are afraid, that all the things they have ever worshipped under the influence of false religion are nothing but the fancies and fantasies of despondent and fearful minds, and that prophets have been most influential with the common people and most formidable to their kings when their kingdoms were in the greatest distress. But I think this is all well enough known to everyone, and I will not go further into it here.
Okay. All right, read on.
Since dread is the cause of superstition, it plainly follows that everyone is naturally prone to it, despite the theory that some people hold that it arises from men's having a confused idea of God.
That's in some ways that's Maimonides, right? Maimonides is very big on the notion that confused notions of God lead to incorrect beliefs and therefore incorrect actions. But that isn't just Maimonides. I mean, that was a very common medieval idea, philosophical idea. Go on.
It also follows that superstition must be just as variable and unstable as all absurd leaps of the mind and powerful emotions are, and can only be sustained by hope and hatred, anger and deception. This is because such instability does not spring from reason, but from passion alone, in fact from the most powerful of the passions. Therefore it is easy for people to be captivated by a superstition, but difficult to ensure that they remain loyal to it.
Now, what's interesting is notice he is juxtaposing the mind versus the passion. And he is one of these people, this is kind of, he was somewhat ascetic in his own lifestyle. He is very much a believer as a philosopher of the importance of reason as opposed to emotion. I mean, this again goes back to medieval ideas of the divisions of the soul, that there is a sharp division between your emotional part and your rational part. We know that that's not true today, but that was very important in philosophy, going, as I said, right into the Middle Ages, but very important in his own day. Yes, Robert?
Most powerful of the passions?
Yes.
What is that? Is that religion or is that sex?
Fear.
Fear, perhaps. I don't know. I'm not sure what he means by that.
Was he married?
No, he never got married. Go on.
In fact, because
This corner votes for sex.
Yeah, undoubtedly it could be. I'm sure maybe Freud interpreted it that way, but anyway, go on.
In fact, because the common people everywhere live in the same wretched state, they never adhere to the same superstition for very long. It is only a new form of credulity that really pleases them, one that has not yet let them down. Big star in my
Yes, and here we may see an allusion to all kinds of strange stuff that was going on by radical Protestant sects and perhaps the Sabbateans, right?
Such instability of mind has been the cause of many riots and ferocious wars.
Which he himself has witnessed.
For, as is clear from what we have just said, and as Curtius quite rightly notes at 410, nothing governs the multitude as effectively as superstition. Hence, people are easily led, under pretense of religion, sometimes to adore their kings as gods, and at other times to curse them and detest them as the universal scourge.
And
of
notice he's
mankind.
begun to talk about the relationship between religion and politics here.
Right.
Yeah.
Did Marx read this?
Yes, Marx read Spinoza. Absolutely. Marx read Spinoza. If you look up on Wikipedia the article on Spinoza and they give you a list of people influenced by Spinoza, they give you at least a half a dozen really important people in the 19th and 20th century. Because Einstein, liked Spinoza a lot. Go on.
To cope with this difficulty, a great deal of effort has been devoted to adorning religion, whether true or false, with pomp and ceremony, so that everyone would find it more impressive than anything else, and observe it zealously with the highest degree of fidelity. The Turks, that is, the Muslims,
That's because when he says the Turk, he's referring to Islam.
have organized this very effectively.
In other words, this is a typical European prejudice against Islam. You have to understand, in the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was at beginning to wane, but still was extremely powerful, and in fact ruled over large parts of what we would call Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and was a constant threat. The Europeans it was really the 16th century when the Ottomans were the most powerful, and they're beginning to wane at this point. But they were still seen as a very serious threat to Europe.
Believing as they do that it is wicked even to argue about religion, they fill the minds of every individual with so many prejudices that they leave no room for sound reason, let alone for doubt.
So he's putting on Islam the notion that you're not even allowed to talk about religion, right? That you cannot, that freedom of thought is suppressed. And he's using that as a foil, obviously, for what was going on in his own day amongst the strict Calvinists, right? So let's go to the next page. Cal, do you want to pick it up? Number 7?
It may indeed be the highest secret of monarchical government and utterly essential to it to keep men deceived and to disguise the fear that sways them with the specious name of religion, so that they will fight for their servitude as if they were fighting for their own deliverance. They will not think it humiliating, but supremely glorious to spill their blood and sacrifice their lives for the glorification of a single man.
Notice the attack on monarchy here. This is part of his republicanism, right? That monarchs will use religion and therefore especially superstition to maintain their hold and to get people to do whatever they want. And this builds upon their fears. Okay, read on.
But in a free republic, on the other hand, nothing that can be devised or attempted will be less successful. For it is completely contrary to the common liberty to shackle the free judgment of the individual with prejudices or constraints of any kind. Alleged subversion for ostensibly religious reasons undoubtedly arises only because the laws are enacted about doctrinal matters, and beliefs are subjected to prosecution and condemnation as if they were crimes. And those who support and subscribe to these condemned beliefs are sacrificed not for the common welfare, but to the hatred and cruelty of their enemies.
Okay, so first of all, he compares in a republic, right? In a true republic, there will be complete freedom of thought. But in other places, you have religious persecution. People are condemned for what they believe. And here, there is no doubt he's thinking of his friend, Adrian Carbaugh, who died in prison for his beliefs. Okay, read on.
However, if the laws of the state prescribed only wrongful deeds and left words free, such subversion could not be made to proclaim itself lawful, and intellectual disputes could not be turned into sedition.
There it is. Freedom of thought allows, eliminates all of these kinds of horrible kinds of possible abuses of power. And again, this is where he's talking about separating, religion from the state, right? Read on.
We are fortunate to enjoy the rare happiness of living in a republic where every person's liberty to judge for himself is respected. Everyone is permitted to worship God according to his own mind, and nothing is thought dearer or sweeter than freedom.
Now he knows that this isn't true.
Right, that's
This is the ideal. This is the ideal of the Republicans in the Netherlands.
Or was he being sarcastic?
No, he was not being sarcastic. Don't forget, he's being cautious. Right? In other words, he's trying to ask the Dutch to live up to their best ideals. Go on.
I thought, therefore, that I would be doing something which was neither offensive nor useless, for I show that this freedom may not only be allowed without danger to piety and the stability of the Republic, but cannot be refused without destroying the peace of the Republic and piety itself. This is the core thesis that I have set out to demonstrate in this treaty.
So he's saying true religion is not threatened by freedom of thought. Right? And again, he's repeating what he put on the title page here, right? This is his aim. Go on.
In order to do so, it is chiefly necessary for me to describe our most powerful prejudices about religion, which are vestiges of our ancient servitude, as well as our assumptions about the authority of sovereigns. For there are many men who take the outrageous liberty of trying to appropriate the greater part of this authority and utilize religion to win the allegiance of the common people, who are still enthralled to pagan superstition, with the aim of bringing us all back into servitude again. I plan to give a brief outline of the order in which I shall demonstrate these things, but first I want to explain why I was impelled to write.
So he knows that there's a struggle going on in the Republic over this, right? It's not a sure thing. And we know it wasn't a sure thing, right? And you know, even after his death, this is going to be, you know, and this is an issue that's still live today, is it not?
Sure is.
Right? What is the role of of religion and government? Right? It's still a very, very live thing. And, you know, we're so caught up here in the United States, but there are struggles of this going on in any democratic society. And, you know, the United States version of the separation of church and state is just one version of this. There's, you know, in France, they have a much stricter version of this. In England, technically, England is still, you know, the Queen is still head of the church, right? Right? Which is called establishmentarianism, right? By the way, the famous longest word in the English Bible, anti-disestablishmentarianism, is the people who are against those who want to separate the church from the government. Disestablishment is let the Queen no longer be the head of the church. Make a separation of church and state. That was the argument. So if you were against that, you were an anti-disestablishmentarianist. All right. Cal, how many have you read? One paragraph? Two. Okay. So, Harvey, do you want to let's pick it up number 9?
I've often been amazed to find the people who are proud to profess the Christian religion, that is, the religion of love, joy, peace, moderation, and goodwill, to all men, and opposing each other with extraordinary animosity, and giving daily expression to the bitterest mutual hatred. So much so that it has become easier to recognize an individual's faith by the latter features than by the former.
Sound familiar?
It has been the case for a long time that one can hardly know whether anyone is a Christian, Turk, Jew, or Gentile, other than that he has a certain appearance, and dresses in a certain way, or attends one or another church, upholds a certain belief, or pays allegiance to one magistrate rather than another. Otherwise, their lives are identical to each other.
Okay, in other words, you know, Dutchmen walking around, you wouldn't necessarily know. Even the Jews, you know, they didn't wear anything. At that time, they didn't have to wear special clothing or anything of the sort. Go on.
In searching out the reason for this deplorable situation, I never doubted that it arose because in the religion of the common people, serving the church, it has been regarded as worldly career. What should be its
unpretentious
offices, being seen as lucrative positions, and its pastors considered great dignity.
And this is a kind of anti-clericalism that you often find, right? Again, coming out of the Protestant attack upon Catholic clergy, but again, the idea that the church is a career, right? That people get worldly advancement, and he thinks that's a terrible abuse. Go on. As soon as this
As
abuse
began in the church, the worst kind of people came to fill the sacred offices.
and the impulse.
And the impulse spread God's religion, degenerated into sordid greed and ambition. Churches became theaters where people went to hear ecclesiastical orators rather than to learn from teachers. Pastors no longer sought to teach, but strove to win a reputation for themselves, while denigrating those who disagreed with them, and by teaching new and controversial doctrines designed to seize the attention of the common people. This was bound to generate a great deal of conflict, rivalry, and resentment, which no passage of time could heal.
What's interesting is he is in some ways applying what the Protestant movement was trying to do originally, was to go back to what they thought was the original church, right? To sort of say that all the buildup of the church hierarchy, the sacraments, and everything else that the Catholic Church had done over centuries and centuries was a degeneration of the original pure religion of Jesus. So he's sort of doing the same thing here. He's saying it started off with this really good thing, but then it degenerated, right?
It's Maimonides too, a little bit, no?
No.
The religious is not...
No, Maimonides said that originally all people were monotheists, but...
No, that the leaders of the religion should not make it their profession.
Yeah, well, that's true, yes, but that was more of a technical thing. But here, this is definitely this notion, if we only went back to the primitive church, and you still hear this today, by the way, with Christians, Christian sects that, very much say, we're trying to go back to the way things originally were, right? Go on, unsurprisingly
It's
then.
very dangerous because it looks like a polemic against the church specifically.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Well, this guy's speaking truth to power,
Yeah, but he's also going to attack, Judaism as well. But I mean, the fact is that no, I mean, he thinks the same thing about Judaism. For him, rabbinical Judaism is the degeneration of Judaism, which again is a very typical, as Yuval would say, a Marrano thing to do, right? So he sees the rabbis as the equivalent of all of this.
Well, he says this is true of anyone, a Christian, Church, Jew, or Gentile.
Right, exactly. Read on.
Unsurprisingly, then, nothing remains of the religion of the early church except the external ritual by which the common people seem to adulate rather than venerate God. And faith amounts to nothing more than credulity and prejudices. And what prejudices they are. They turn natural men into brutes, since they completely prevent each person from using his own free judgment and distinguishing truth from falsehood. They seem
purposely
designed altogether to extinguish the light of the intellect. Dear God, piety and religion are reduced to ridiculous mysteries, and those who totally condemn reason, reject and revile the
understanding
as corrupt by nature are believed without question to possess the divine light, which is the most iniquitous aspect of the world. Clearly, if these men had even a spark of divine light, they would not rave so arrogantly. They would learn to revere God with more good sense and surpass other men in love as they now surpass nor would they persecute so fiercely those who disagree with them. They would have compassion for them. They really do fear for these people's salvation more than for their own advancement.
And again, think about his own family history of the Inquisition, attack on the conversos. And when he says church here, I think he means any kind of established religion. he's not just talking about Christianity here. He's talking about it really kind of, he's using the word church to mean any kind of established official religion.
It would be interesting to know what the word was in the original text.
Yeah, ecclesia probably, something like that, So the point is that he's using it in a general sense. Because again, he's not identifying himself. He's writing this in Latin, which is the language of the scholars, right, and an educated people. And it was a universal, therefore anybody in any country who was educated would have learned Latin and therefore would have read this. By the way, he always resisted this being translated into Dutch during his lifetime.
Why is that?
So available to everybody.
Yeah, I thought the wrong people would read it. He was also, again, he was extremely cautious. It eventually was translated later on into English. I don't remember if it was ever translated into Dutch, but the point is, or parts of it was translated in English. But you notice it. So, all right, we'll stop there today, and I'm just going to turn off the record. Anybody have any questions though before at this point? Okay, so let me just turn this off. Hang on.